Maximilien Robespierre has been one of history's most controversial figures since the French Revolution. Often treated as one and the same with the Reign of Terror, Robespierre was a tyrant, a martyr, an excessive or necessary evil depending on who you ask and when and where you ask them. First, some context. Who was Maximilien Robespierre? Robespierre was a leading figure in the French Revolution, belonging to the radical wing of the Jacobins. While he was appointed as a member of the Committee of Public Safety, he began to advocate for harsh and often extreme measures against fellow revolutionaries and citizens during the period known as the Reign of Terror. It's often this period of trials, purges and executions that first comes to mind when thinking of the French Revolution, and it is Robespierre who is most often declared wholly responsible. Robespierre is accused of paranoia, excess and tyranny in many interpretations, and the most charitable of these a fanatic who took it too far, and the most condemnatory a monster with a black heart. He is sometimes held aloft as a revolutionary hero, perhaps a martyr for a cause greater than himself, or an inspiration for revolutionaries of this day to look back on. In some cases, he is treated more like a symbol, a moment or a process in history separate from morality or human agency, a historical importance greater than the man himself. Robespierre's reputation came under attack several times during his life, particularly from presses with royalist sympathies in 1790 and from Girondist elements in 1792. But it was only after his arrest and subsequent execution that attacking his image became as symbolically important. In the wake of the Thermidor reaction in July 1794, the need to justify the arrest and execution without trial resulted in royalists and republicans creating an image of Robespierre either as a megalomaniac or hypocrite with kingly ambitions, or as a fanatical mass-murdering lunatic, depending on their particular position. This sparked a trend in the subsequent decades, particularly among rightists of invoking the same name Robespierre when the left took ascent, like the leftist election victories of 1789 and 1790, intending to suggest that they would bring about another reign of terror. The excesses of the Robespierre regime became a cautionary tale that could be used by the right to immediately incite unease towards less conservative politics. Similarly, in the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, monarchist opponents of Napoleon nicknamed him Robespierre II to imply links to Jacobinism and tyrannical excess. In the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, classic liberal history split the revolution into two: the good in 1789 and the bad associated with Robespierre. Robespierre's image was now used to sanitize the revolution, distancing liberals who supported republicanism but were aware of the negative image the terror had attracted to the revolution from those elements of its history. The Restoration in 1814 saw anti-revolutionary rhetoric take the opposite view, that Robespierre was not the sole creator of the terror, but an inevitable product of a revolution that was destined for excess. In a sense, Robespierre's image became more than an aspect of historical memory. He was now a political tool. His image was unquestionably negative, but its exact meaning was changed to fit the job. It could be used by right Republicans, liberals and monarchists alike to disparage political opponents. As time drew on and the terror slipped into recent but ever more distant memory, Robespierre's image changed. The republicanism of the 1820s saw Robespierre used not as a way to slander an opposing political movement, but as a rallying point. His writings were promoted and his image and legacy revived, a counter-legend created to embody republican virtue, democracy and order. His image was washed of king-like accusations. However, with the growth of socialism and the creation of a more radical left wing, his image among left revolutionaries in 1848, the year of revolutions, became that of a bourgeois statist guilty of crushing workers' movements. The anarchist Mikhail Bakunin called the Jacobins politically red, claiming that they were too politically minded and ultimately never came for the institution of private property. The right continued to live in fear of the Reign of Terror. With the revolution entering the domain of cultural memory, Robespierre began to appear in fictionalized form, his image used as a narrative tool. In 1874, 3 years after the fall of the Paris Commune, Victor Hugo published 93, a novel set during the counter-revolutionary uprisings of 1793. Robespierre is depicted in a scene which he argues with revolutionaries Danton and Marat in a cafe as an uncompromising and incorruptible republican. Regardless of the specific morality of Robespierre's actions, his degree of conviction is treated as a virtue, one which the story also praises in royalist characters. In this context, Robespierre mattered more as a symbol reflecting pure conviction and belief rather than a moral or political tool. In 1835, George Buchner wrote a play titled Danton's Death, following the life of George Danton in the years leading up to his death. In the play, Robespierre is not depicted as a character with a moral orientation or agency in the story, more as the embodiment of a certain perspective. Robespierre is not a man in this play, but a narrative force. Buchanan's play was not staged until 1902. Theatres wouldn't dare because of Robespierre's portrayal as ultimately having the people in a plighting mind, despite his excesses. By 1902 this was acceptable enough to perform. Robespierre had been entirely transformed into something symbolic, even abstract, and it was becoming less unheard of to portray him in any way other than negatively. Entering the 20th century, Robespierre's image was no longer purely negative. Where once the symbolic use of his name was a way to slander political opponents, a word synonymous with excess and tyranny, he now represented a different political meaning. In 1904, Vladimir Lenin referred to the Russian Social Democrats as Jacobins, indissolubly connected with the organization of the proletariat. In fact, in Russian left politics surrounding the turn of the 20th century, language of Jacobinism and Girondism were used as political ammunition, quite similarly to the years following the Reign of Terror. The more radical Bolsheviks were cast as Jacobins by their political enemies, and in return they cast the Mensheviks as the more conservative Girondists. Then in November 1918, just preceding the first anniversary of the Bolshevik October Revolution, a statue of Robespierre was put up in Moscow. In commissioning the statue, a connection was drawn between the revolutions of Robespierre and the Bolsheviks. The implication was that much like Robespierre, the Bolsheviks were tearing down monarchy, establishing a regime for the people, and pushing through a revolution according to incorruptible and unwavering conviction. The Bolsheviks having cast off the Mensheviks, their own Russian Girondists. Robespierre represented the spirit of revolution and helped the Bolsheviks legitimize their revolutionary policy. Robespierre was now representative of revolution in the broadest sense possible. Meanwhile, the likeness of Robespierre was also making a foray into the world of cinema. D.W. Griffith's 1921 film Orphans of the Storm demonstrates an early appearance of Robespierre on the screen. In his portrayal here and later in 1949 in Anthony Mann's The Black Book, Robespierre is represented through a shadowy film noir style, almost a scheming supervillain. He appears inhuman at times. Western, typically American cinema, particularly during the Cold War, was heavily influenced by previous interpretations of Robespierre as a sinister black legend. The portrayals of Robespierre as a paranoid, trigger-happy megalomaniac ready to murder at a moment's notice would have naturally inspired images of Joseph Stalin in contemporary audiences. Cold War attitudes coloured the Western public's views on revolution in general, and as a result, those monstrous, almost comically sinister visions of Robespierre were formed. The imagery of the Reign of Terror dominates these early Western cinematic portrayals of the French Revolution, represented in the form of Robespierre, and the links they make to Bolshevism are unignorable. Cinema, in some sense, was lagging behind, where literature and theatre had entered the 20th century taking on controversial and humanising, although not necessarily sympathetic representations. Western cinema returned to a more conservative viewpoint, perhaps reflective of the official cultural position of the West against idealism and top-down revolution. Hilary Mantel's 1992 novel A Place of Greater Safety portrayed Robespierre not as a martyr or a villain, instead following his psychological development through his life, treating him as a man. Assassin's Creed Unity was released by Ubisoft Entertainment in 2014. The game's narrative is set during the French Revolution and features Robespierre as a secondary antagonist. Much like the representations of early 19th century political consensus in Red Scare-era American cinema, Unity represents Robespierre as a fanatical and paranoid tyrant. The responses drawn out by Unity's decisions with regards to the image of Maximilien Robespierre demonstrate present-day perceptions of the man as a historical figure quite well. The French left, at the time of Unity's release, broadly speaking, objected to the portrayal of Robespierre as a vicious, blood-soaked tyrant responsible for deaths in thousands. The French right mocked this objection. Leftist politicians Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Alexis Corbière were particularly vocal about this portrayal, arguing that in some sense it smeared French history and insulted the French people, exaggerating the excesses of Robespierre's reign of terror in order to discredit the Republic. Ubisoft's response was confusing and contradictory, but illuminating. The game's producer, Antoine Vimal de Monte, argued that the game was for the mass public and was not a history lesson. Simultaneously, Alex Amancio, the creative director, explained that the game tried very hard to portray things as factually as possible. The game holds some claim to historical accuracy, but only with regards to public expectations. The established cultural understanding of the Reign of Terror and Maximilien Robespierre is still that of a tyrant, bathing in staggering, blood-soaked excess. Political figures and material can diverge from accepted and official cultural perceptions, as can historiography. Literature manages to do so too, as a more democratized medium than the notoriously inaccessible mediums of cinema and digital gaming. In Western monoculture, particularly accelerated by Cold War attitudes and 20th century taste-making media and carried on by mainstream interactive media in the 21st century, the perception of Robespierre is that of a tyrant, a perception not far from from the way his image was constructed by opponents and replacements to his regime in the 1790s and early 19th century. It is this cultural consensus that encourages media to keep these conservative depictions as they are. Just like Buchner's play in the 1830s, it is a risk for mainstream media producers to provide a portrayal that strays too far from the established expectations. Robespierre's image has changed over time. It has become more forgivable for creators in certain mediums to portray him in ways other than what is established, but the use of his legacy as a political tool remains much the same, and so too does the relationship between inaccessible mainstream establishment media and the historical image.